I want to stop and talk for a second because you brought up the DSM.
Sure.
And we know that we showed the clip earlier of you on KTLA talking with Nancy Alspaugh-Jackson about, because there's a lot of people who are concerned right now about what's going to happen with the DSM-5, and I totally respect your opinion, and I loved you saying that the intent here was always to help us to have a better understanding.
Right.
You know, there's been a recent article that came out that suggests that over half of the kids that currently qualify for a diagnosis aren't going to get one. I know that's a lot of speculation because we don't even know exactly what the criteria are going to be, but help us to understand as parents from your point of view of, you know, should we be panicking at this point?
Not at all. I really don't think so. I mean, first of all, I've been through I think, 3 changes of the DSM. So I went through, one of the DSM earlier versions, I don't remember really, I think it was 3, or I'm not sure, it used to require 16 symptoms, and it was 1 diagnosis, you know, autism. And then things changed, and, you know, the DSM-4R, which is the current DSM, it got better in terms of, like, it became more specific, you know, so it allowed us, I think, to look more at the detail that was relevant when it came out, like in the 90s, middle 90s, 94 when it came out. That was the autism we were seeing. It was very easy at that point. It wasn't a crazy number of kids coming in that we weren't sure about.
Right.
And I've always said this, and I'll get back to this, is that the form of autism has changed and continues to change, which is very interesting as well.
It is interesting.
Yeah. So back then it was working, it was fine. I always felt there were a few problems with it. One was that it differentiated, well, a couple of different things. One was, okay, so we were mainly, right now what we do is we mainly look at 3 different diagnoses within the chapter of pervasive developmental disorders. Pervasive developmental disorders being like anything that is more than one area of deficit, right? So it's pervasive. And the 3 are Asperger's, autism, and PDD, so pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. Autism is currently based on 6 symptoms. Of those 6 present symptoms, 2 have to be in the sort of social communication area. And it was very difficult when kids started to look, when you looked at it, it was difficult because, for instance, if you had a communication delay, it would definitely result in some form of social delay as well. So the symptoms were affecting each other. And then there was sort of this requirement of having a series of what is called stereotypic repetitive behaviors, which in behavior analysis, you know, we call self-stimulatory behaviors. And so it was just, it became harder and harder. Not that you couldn't, I mean, I sometimes I would look at a child and spend 5 minutes with a child. For me, it was very easy because I could immediately tell whether the child was in this area or not, and then I would go back and check off because I didn't need to really look at the list, you know. So for me, it was fine, it worked. I didn't really give it too much attention. And it was easy for me to differentiate the kids. But one of the problems with the DSM is that, for instance, with Asperger's kids, it would essentially say, okay, you have the same symptoms, but you don't really have a language or communication delay. And that was not accurate. You know, when you look at the kids with Asperger's, there's a pragmatic language problem, which really falls more under social delay, but hey, it's there. And it's very hard for the kids to understand social things just because the language capacity is not there for advanced language. And there's some, you know, pretty rote, repetitive things, which I see mostly as being related to anxiety, you know, and so so I'm happy that the kids have gone under one thing called autism spectrum. I think for kids with Asperger's and PDD, it's a huge step forward because they will now be eligible for funding. Now that's huge, right? In all previous funding, The kids with Asperger's or PDD, which means the higher functioning kids, would just have nothing, no funding, not eligible. So now they will be, which is going to be just terrific, absolutely terrific. Then also I think that they've added some things to the new diagnosis which are important, like sensory.
Oh, good.
You know, sensory has never come up, and that's just so ridiculous, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's such a huge portion of what our kids go in sensory dysregulation. The vast majority of our kids have some form of sensory problem, whether it's how they receive visual information, how they receive auditory information, or just the need for tactile stimulation, the need for, you know, pressure, all that sort of stuff. They're completely dysregulated.
Yeah.
And we really try very hard to build that into their treatment plan, because I mean, you have a hyperactive child and you do certain sensory activities, the child calms down, you can teach them better. If you use stimuli that are visual for kids who have problems with auditory input, they go so much faster. I mean, there's a million things you could do with the sensory issues. So the mention of the fact that, you know, they consider now having those sensory issues as one of the possible symptoms. That's terrific.
Great.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that. Nobody's been talking about that because everybody's been talking about, oh, they're not going to qualify, they're not going to qualify.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't think so. I mean, it's, you know, 5 symptoms across the board. So I'm fine with the new system.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to be too harmful. I think that what they've done is, because it's, you know, they've taken away the categories of social communication and so on, and they require 5. But what you have is now a level. And that's great, because
I think so too.
Absolutely. And they determine the level. We have this in other psychiatric issues as well. The way they define the levels are sort of by the amount of support needed. So if you need a lot of support, that would be considered a severe level. If you need medium or light. And I think that's fine. That's how we treat it anyway.
Yeah.
Still, though, having said that, Shannon, I have to say my biggest problem with the diagnosis is that, you know, we're changing it, that's great. We're doing the best we can with the knowledge we have. But in the long run, autism needs to come out of the diagnostic manual for mental disorders. I see autism more like something like phenylketonuria. Like, it is biochemical, it is biomedical in origin, and then leads to a series of behaviors and, you know, things that make it harder for us to adapt and survive. But when you diagnose something like autism just based on the symptoms, behavioral symptoms, then everyone focuses just on the behavioral symptoms, and nobody really asks, what caused this, you know? And so my personal process at CARD, and I try to train my supervisors to do this as much as possible, is to figure out for each child what caused it, you know, and when did it happen? Because when it happened, if we can identify a time frame, it helps us to identify you know, where the level of development kind of halted or plateaued, and then to take off from there. But what caused it is important, because, or as much as possible, like we look at the child's labs, we try to figure out if there are issues where the child is just simply not yet healthy. So if he's not sleeping, if he's not eating normally. I mean, how many of my kids come in right off the bat and the parents tell me they're drinking gallons of milk and they are not sleeping, and
which means the parents aren't sleeping, which means everything is degrading.
And if you think about it, like, if you have, you know, and a lot of the kids have gastrointestinal issues, of course, which is also now mentioned in the new diagnostic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and if you have GI issues, if you have bloating and constipation, diarrhea, whatever it is, and a lot of our children do, inflammation of the gut in any form, and you're not sleeping, you basically are going to be functioning at a lower level, whoever it is, a child, us, whatever, right?
Absolutely.
And then we come at you and we try to teach you a million things, and you're gonna react.
Right.
You're going to get tired, you're going to have headaches, which we don't necessarily know about
Right.
because you can't express it.
Right.
You're going to try to avoid the therapy sessions. You're going to react. You're going to have tantrums. And that's just, so if you can help the child feel better right off the bat, sleep better, everything becomes a lot easier,
Absolutely wonderful.